Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. And we are starting a brand new study this week. So if this is your first time with us or you've missed out for a while, this is a good week to jump back in. We are starting our study of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So we just finished up the Thessalonian letters. And those were the earliest letters of Paul and some of the earliest letters and writings we have in the New Testament. Before that, we did Ephesians, and it'll be really good that we studied that letter too in the context of these letters. But now we're getting to some of the last letters, the latest writings in the New Testament. And so basically what I want to do today is I want to give you the context, right? Every time we study anything in the Bible, it's important that we know who wrote it, who they were writing to, and what was their purpose in writing, and any other context stuff. And so this week is just going to be that. We're going to look at those things that it's important that you understand before you get to reading it. You can go ahead and read the Bible and you'll get stuff from it, but the depth that is there in these writings, it's critical that you do go and understand these basic contextual things. Without them, you miss a lot deeper meaning. And so we're gonna be doing that. Now these letters, there's 3 of them, and they're written pretty close together. And so let's just go through and we'll look at who wrote them first. So who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? Most of the time in the Bible, they don't get very creative with who wrote the letter, like the naming of it. So these were written by a guy named John. And there's 2 big theories out there. And both of them are a guy named John wrote them. One was possibly John the Apostle, the one we read about in the gospel accounts, the brother of James, son of Zebedee, and there's good reason, and that's the most probable choice. That's the one that most theologians and really, really smart people who've studied this, that's the conclusion they come to, and we're pretty sure that he wrote the Gospel of John as well. And so that's kind of where the back and forth, the compare and contrast comes from as far as who wrote these. They look at the Gospel of John and look at the style of it. They look at the way it was written, the theological emphasis, the things like that. And they look at these letters and they're pretty sure that they're written by the same people. Like it's pretty obvious, but it's not 100%. So there is a little bit of wiggle room in there. The other person is John the Elder. And really, I personally think this is semantics, but some people don't, and it's important that I present to you all the possibilities. But there's an idea that a guy named John the Elder is different from John the Apostle. Personally, I think it's the same guy. The way that the things that are attributed to John the Elder that come down to us from other church fathers, people who came after, 2nd century, 3rd century, who refer to John the Elder, it all kind of lines up with John the Apostle. And so I personally think this is written by the same guy who wrote the Gospel of John, and the same guy who wrote the Revelation of John. So that's who I think the author is. That's the most probable one. Is John the Apostle, brother of James, son of Zebedee, that we read about in all of the gospel accounts. Now, why is there some confusion about this? Well, the author doesn't name himself, right? The 1st John doesn't name himself. 2nd and 3rd John, he refers to himself as the elder. Again, getting back to the John the Elder thing, but he doesn't name himself. He doesn't introduce himself like the way Paul does in most of his letters. The author of 1st John doesn't do that. He doesn't begin with a formal introduction. He doesn't end with a formal greeting. He just kind of, there's the point, right? It actually tends to flow more like a sermon almost, that this letter was written more of a sermon rather than a letter. As far as the date, we're pretty certain it was right at the end of the 1st century, maybe 100 AD, maybe a little bit after 100 AD, or maybe right before. We know it was referenced as early as 110 AD by another church father. So we know it's at the end of the 1st century. It could be a little bit earlier, but more than likely it's right at the end. And we know this because right before the Jewish War, right, the Jewish War happened in 66 AD. This is when The Jewish peoples revolted against Rome, and they launched into this war, and it did not go well. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and it ended with mass suicide at the Masada. It was not pleasant, and right before it started, a lot of Christians that lived in Palestine and lived in Israel, that region, fled to a province called Asia Minor, or Asia. This is where the city of Ephesus was, which again gets back to that whole Ephesus letter being relevant. The city of Ephesus was the capital of the province of Asia, which is just basically western modern-day Turkey. But a lot of these Christian leaders moved there. Famously, Philip moved there, and John the Apostle moved there. And John set up shop in Ephesus. And so we're pretty certain that John the Apostle wrote this letter from the city of Ephesus. And we know that guys like Polycarp mentioned that the people would come and want to hear John the Apostle's account of the gospel. And when you factor that in, that John the Apostle saw it firsthand, and some of the other things we're going to look at here in a little bit about the heresies that are going on, it makes sense, right? That John the Apostle, a lot of people would have wanted to come and hear his firsthand account of what he saw with Jesus, knowing Jesus. It makes sense with the language, the way he describes Jesus and what Jesus did, that he saw it firsthand, right? And so it works really, really well in that context. It makes the most sense that this is a guy who saw it, and he's left his home and is now set up shop in like one of the most prominent cities, one of the 5 jewels of the Roman Empire. Asia was the richest province outside of Italy itself for Rome. It was incredibly popular and wealthy, and it was a great place to start church, which is why Paul went there, right? So the city itself, if this letter was written from Ephesus, the city Ephesus was hugely influential, right? Paul really established Christianity there in the 50s AD, so about 50 years before the writing of this letter. Christianity might have been introduced before that, but really Paul is the one who really established it there. And Paul did a lot of work, spent a lot of time there. He was imprisoned there. The book of Acts gives us a lot of detail about, his relationship with the people there. After Paul left, there was a turning away from apostolic doctrine, so the doctrine of the apostles. And Paul mentions that in one of his letters to Timothy, where it says, all of Asia has turned against me. Is referencing that. But then when the Jewish war happened, all these true Christians, those who were devoted to the apostles' teaching, moved to the area. They reestablished this apostolic doctrine, this doctrine that's true to the teaching of the apostles. And so that's part of what John's generation moving in there, that wave of migrants and immigrants, that's what that did. It reestablished apostolic doctrine. Now, who was John writing to? Who is this letter written to? Well, it was written almost as a sermon, like I said, as a circular letter. All right, he's writing specifically to the churches that he has influence in. So probably the same churches that Paul wrote Ephesus to. Ephesus was a circular letter written to be passed around. In the same way that circular letter had a specific target audience of churches in Asia, this province, that's the same way 1 John is. It was written with a specific target of this region, the churches in this area, and the issues that they are facing. And so that's the audience. It's written more of a sermon to be passed around kind of deal. 2nd and 3rd John are much more specific. 3rd John is specifically written to a guy named Gaius. Or 3rd John, 2nd John was written to a church. But that being said, so what was the purpose of 1 John? Well, we'll look at 2nd and 3rd John when we get to them. But what was the purpose of 1 John? Well, it was really to combat Gnosticism. Now, when Paul left Ephesus, he said there are going to be those who try to drag you away with false doctrine, these false teachers, and that's what happened, right? But then when John comes along, it's reestablished. Well, the Greek world was all about Platonism, right? Platonism, it was originated by a guy named Plato, one of the absolute most famous people in all of history. But Plato kind of first put forth this idea that the physical world is just a shadow of a truer spiritual world. And so that developed into a widespread popular pop culture of the physical is bad and the spiritual is good. And so our physical bodies are bad, but the spiritual part of us, the truer sense of us, is good and akin to God. And that's pretty much what Gnosticism is in its core. The word Gnostic means knowledge. It's actually where we get the word knowledge, but it's more secret knowledge. So as we talk about Gnosticism, it's important that you know that there's no like a book of Gnosticism, because it was secret knowledge. You didn't write it down. It was all about secret knowledge and these rituals to get you to the next level of your spiritual being. And so that had infiltrated into a lot of Christian circles. And when we get to 2nd and 3rd John, specifically, he names names of these are people who are preaching this baloney that's against, what Jesus taught. And so it really came down to a couple things. The first one is that they denied Jesus' messiahship. John addresses that a lot, that there are those who deny Jesus' messiahship. And these aren't necessarily from within. These are more than likely Jewish people who were just struggling to come to terms with this. Because you got to remember that the Jewish mind, the Messiah, they were going to set up this age to come. And this age to come, Israel would be on top. And Jesus being a crucified Messiah was almost impossible to accept, because that meant the Messiah lost. He was killed. The Messiah doesn't get killed in their minds. And then the temple was destroyed and Israel is scattered again. Like, that's even worse than before Jesus came. So there's just no way in their minds that Jesus really was the Messiah. So that's one issue of it. The other side of it, and this is more the Gnostic branch, is they denied the incarnation. And again, the Gnostic idea is that physical is bad. And so if God comes to earth, there's no way he'll put on this evil, wicked, fleshly body. It's called Docetism. Docetism is the idea that Jesus wasn't actually incarnated, that it was just something that looked like it. The word dokine, which is where we get Docetism, actually means to seem. So you could almost transliterate it seemism, right? Like, it seemed like Jesus was in a physical body, but he really wasn't. That's the kind of the idea here, that he only seemed physical. And so Gnostics they had three camps, right? And again, there's no unified code of Gnosticism. There's no different denominations of Gnosticism. They're just everything was kept secret, so we have to pick what we can from the arguments against it. But the three main camps of Gnostics are, one is the ascetic camp. And the ascetic camp is, we're not going to give our flesh side anything. So these would be people that reject marriage, that reject having sex, that reject pleasure. They just live a solitary, or at best very weekly communal existence where they just reject all the pleasures of life. They're all ascetic, right? Because they don't want to give their flesh any joy, any happiness, because it's evil. Then you have the opposite branch of a hedonistic way of living, where our bodies are evil and they don't matter, and so we can do whatever we want with them because they don't matter. That's the other side of it, right? So you have ascetic, you have a hedonistic, and then you have the third branch, and this is the one that had the most damage, or it seems to have the most damage based on John's writings, is the sinless branch of Gnosticism. And this is the group that had decided they had become so perfect that their spiritual side was so good that they were incapable of sin. If they sinned, it was their flesh. It wasn't them. They didn't have sin. So even with that, you can hear John saying the parts where he talks about, that you lie if you say you don't have sin. Like, he's directly addressing this group. That people with these Gnostics would say they don't have sin. But they're Gnostic Christians, though. It's important to remember that they believe they're Christians, but they believe they have the secret knowledge that nobody else does. And they also wrote Gospels, like a lot of apocryphal books. Apocrypha is a word that just means it's not gelling with Orthodox theology or accepted theology. And so we have the Gospel of Peter is one. Another one would be the Acts of John. And these are both false gospels that teach a Gnostic way of viewing what happened. At one point when Jesus, a famous part of them is a guy named Jesus was just a normal human being, and he walked around this earth as a good, godly man, but then at Jesus' baptism, the Christ entered into him in the form of a dove, and that's when the incarnation happened. Then right before his suffering, he left again. So it was just the dude suffering, not the actual Christ. I think it's in the Gospel of John, or the Acts of John, I'm sorry, where John the Apostle is actually in a cave while the crucifixion is happening, having a conversation with this Christ who has left the physical Jesus, and telling him like, hey, yeah, my body down there is being, tortured and crucified right now. Like, it's just very, it's a very Gnostic way of looking at things, and it's very false. It's a false gospel. But they're things that John is addressing. The Gospel of Peter and the Acts of John were both written mid to late 2nd century, so those weren't works that John knew directly, but the ideas within them were definitely being spread about during John's day. And so that kind of gets us to why, right? That explains why. Why did John write this gospel? It was because he's having to fight these false ideas and these false Christianity everywhere. And so who wrote the gospel, or the 1st, 2nd, 3rd John? More than likely John the Apostle, who was also John the Elder. That is the conclusion I've come to. Who was he writing to? It was a sermon, basically, to kind of get spread about, to address, and this is the purpose, to address these Gnostic ideas and heresies that are infiltrating the church. And so we'll delve into each of those issues more deeply as they come about in the letter. But hopefully this gives you a foundation as we dig into 1 John next week. So hopefully we'll see you then.